Today on the Texas Tribune Weekend Insider. In Midland, the oil boom is bringing new jobs, new people, and new money to the local economy. But the explosion in the community's population also brings challenges. The same is true on the Texas coast. Spurred by cheap natural gas prices, at least a half dozen chemical plants are planning expansion there. Does Texas have enough water and electricity to support the boom? Reporter Kate Galbraith visits both places. But first, Emily Foxhall introduces us to Freedom Place, the first safe house in Texas for sex trafficking victims that focuses solely on this issue. The home opens at a time of increased attention on how to provide services for minors who have been forced into prostitution.
Prior to 2010, all minors who were involved in sex trafficking in Texas were considered criminals. But in 2010, with a case in the Supreme Court called in the case of BW, and BW was a girl who was a 13-year-old who had been picked up for being involved in prostitution. She was charged as a prostitute, so as a criminal. But the case went to the Supreme Court, and they decided that because she was 13 and could not legally consent to sex, then she, by the same token, cannot legally consent to prostitution, so she should be considered a victim rather than like a perpetrator of a crime. So after that case was a huge mindset switch in terms of whether she was a criminal or a victim, and that's when it started to move forward to ask how the state should really be serving victims who were minors involved in prostitution. So now that the focus of the state is really on how to provide these victim services, there have been a lot of questions of the proper model. And Freedom Place is a privately owned operation that is a 30-bed safe house that opened about a month and a half ago outside of Houston. And it basically looks like a big summer camp. They have ropes course, they have horses available, they have a lake, and it's in this big lodge with the purpose being that they want this to be a place where girls feel welcome and where they want to stay and they won't run back to their pimp or their John. Therapy is provided for them there, all their meals are provided there. So it's basically a rehabilitation center for them to spend anywhere between 9 and 18 months before they feel ready to live independently. So the state of Texas is ranked best in terms of legislation surrounding sex trafficking issues for domestic minors. So we're talking about kids who are under the age of 18, but they're not internationally trafficked, they're Americans. But Texas lacks what's known as a safe harbor law, which is legislation that really formally dictates what should happen to a minor once he or she is picked up in terms of getting them into victim services. So right now what has to happen is a lot of victims are charged with a related crime such as drug possession or truancy in order to get them into any sort of rehab center that's provided by the juvenile justice system. So the question is whether or not the state should want more places such as Freedom Place or should be working still within the juvenile justice system to provide the proper services for these kids.
Midland is having a major oil boom. They've been having it for the last couple of years. I mean, it's swelling the city's population. People are just flooding in. Midland produces about 14%, or the Permian Basin, which includes Midland, produces about 14% of the nation's oil, and so that's just brought people in. It's got the lowest unemployment rate in Texas, 3.8%, and people are just flocking in, and there's nowhere to house them. You know, where do they eat? You know, where do you house workers who will work in restaurants? They're having to make some difficult decisions. I mean, you know, hotels are being built like crazy. I mean, they're putting up some man camps, you know, sort of trailer huts that oil workers can live in. There's lots of building activity, and they're thinking about, you know, should we spend a lot of money to build new schools? I mean, Midland has been a place of boom and bust ever since oil was discovered there in the 20s. And everyone says, you know, this boom will inevitably end in bust. You know, it's just a question of when, and that's what nobody knows. And so kind of how much do you build? How much does a new business invest in expansion if you just don't know how long the good times are going to run? And down on the coast, the Gulf Coast, there's a different kind of boom. Basically, there's a petrochemical plant expansion announcement seemingly every week. And it's sort of related because it's also based on these same techniques of hydraulic fracturing. These plants run off natural gas, and So with natural gas super cheap because of all this fracking activity, these plants are saying, wow, we can make plastics and things like this for cheap, so let's expand here. And it's amazing. I mean, Texas seems to be, to an extent, outcompeting or competing with China. Who knew? People are saying that, you know, these chemical plant expansion announcements, if they all get built, which is not certain, you know, would be basically the biggest expansion since the 80s of petrochemical facilities in Texas. And that creates some environmental concerns like, you know, are we going to have a lot more pollution and ozone, and, you know, do we have enough water? Is our electric grid reliable enough? That sort of thing. But, you know, these are some big names, and, you know, they're spending billions, and they think it's going to work.